Hey everyone, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. So I've had a lot of requests over the past month or so asking about how to get the best PSP emulation settings for the RG351P. And the truth is about PSP emulation is that it's a hard nut to crack because there are multiple different firmwares, there are different emulators within each of these firmwares, and additionally there are a bunch of different settings you can use for individual games. And if you put all that together, it's kind of a recipe for disaster. So today we're going to go through and look at all the available options you have for emulation, and then which ones perform the best. And we'll also talk a little bit about tempering your expectations when it comes to PSP gameplay on this chipset in particular. So without any further delay, let's jump into it. So if you've watched any of my other videos, you know I love Venn diagrams. It's just an easy way to take very complicated things and simplify them. So let's take a minute and talk about the different PSP emulation options you have across the RG351P and the RG351M and the 4 firmwares that you have available. Let's start with the stock firmware, which is the green circle at the bottom here. You can see it has 2 different emulators available for you. The first one is just called PPSSPP, and they name it RG351P in the menu for some reason. And really all it is just a standalone version of the PSP emulator. And this is the default emulator that comes with your device. It can also run the libretro or RetroArch core of PPSSPP, which you can also find on 351elec and ArkOS as well. So all 3 of these firmwares share the same emulators. Now what the stock firmware doesn't have is the version 1.10.3 version of PPSSPP. Now this was originally ported over onto Batacera, but then ArkOS and 351elec also picked up on it, and now this is the default emulator for all 3 of those firmwares. And finally, ArkOS also carries the Odroid Go Advanced version of PPSSPP, which is called PPSSPP Go. And I feel like I've said the letter P and the letter S so many times at this point, but the point I'm trying to make here is that despite having all these different firmwares, the majority of them actually use the same version of PPSSPP, and that's the default one that we're going to be using for the most part. ArkOS is a little bit unique in that it has an additional emulator that you can use at your disposal, and there are some times where that one works better than the standard one. So when it comes down to it, ArkOS I would say has the most flexibility when it comes to PSP emulation, but 351elec and Batacera are really close behind because the version 1.10.3 is the best PSP emulator we have for this chipset. And just to clarify, the RetroArch core for PPSSPP is pretty lousy. Other than the fact that you can actually use standardized hotkeys and things like that within RetroArch, there's no other advantage for it. I've never seen a single PSP game play better on this core than on any of the other standalone emulators. And honestly, the RG351P version of PSP for the stock firmware that comes with your device, it's okay, but honestly, there's a patch that's involved in the version 1.10.3 that actually speeds things up pretty significantly. So in general, I'm just kind of meh on this stock firmware in general. I think that if you want the best PSP emulation, you're going to want to stick with ArkOS 351elec or Batacera. And if you're not sure what to pick between those 3 firmwares, be sure to check out my firmware comparison guide, which I'll leave linked below, where I went through the paces and talked about every single one of these firmwares and which ones are best for you. Alright, enough of the Venn diagrams, let's actually get into it. We're going to start with 351elec. This is kind of my baseline PSP emulator here. In general, when I'm using PSP emulators, I prefer to use ISO files. They're pretty simple, easy to organize because they come in just one single file. So to set things up, all you have to do is take these ISO files, put them in the PSP folder of your games partition on 351elec, and then the system will recognize them, and all you have to do is go to the PSP folder and then just open them right up. Now the PSP emulator is standalone, so it's a little bit unique, and you don't hit the RetroArch hotkeys to get to it. Instead, for 351elec, you just hit the R3 button. At that point, you can exit out into the menu and you can just access all of your PSP games right then and there. You can also exit the menu at any time as well and go back to your main emulation station menu. Or there's a simple hotkey where you hit select and start and it just closes out of the game and takes you back to the emulation station menu. And that select and start hotkey also works in ArkOS as well as Batacera. Now in order to see which emulators are available to you for the PSP, you just highlight a game, then hit the select button to bring up the menu, and then go to Advanced System Options. And within here, you'll have the choice of picking an emulator. And you can see here, you can pick up the regular standalone PPSSPP, or you can pick out the libretro or RetroArch core. Okay, so let's talk about the settings menu for a second. So all you have to do is go into the menu and then select settings, and there are specific settings that I recommend for default settings. The most important thing you can do is ensure you have buffered rendering, make sure that you set frame skipping to 1, and that the frame skipping type is a number of frames, and that auto frame skip is on. Additionally, there's an option in this emulator where you can change the maximum frames per second, and this will give you a little bit more headroom when it comes to frame skipping and things like that, and I'll demonstrate that here in a second. It isn't going to work perfectly on every game, but I found that this is the best overall way to approach a game, and then you can tweak it from there. Another important setting is the rendering resolution. So at 1:1, that means it's basically just going to show the native PSP resolution. You can pump it up to 2:1, but you'll probably get a lot slower gameplay. And additionally, if you like to look at your frames per second, you're going to want to go down to the bottom of the graphics settings and then adjust the show frames per second counter. And a lot of these default settings are actually optimized for the best emulation, but the last thing you want to do is you want to go into the systems folder, and then you want to change the CPU clock speed. A lot of people have it set to 333, but I found that if you set it to 0, it actually gives you an auto setting, and that tends to have the best compatibility. So if there are certain games that won't boot at all, I would make sure that your clock speed is set to auto. But if you're really having performance issues with a single game, I would go in and change that maybe to 333 or even 666. I've heard that one works pretty well too. Okay, so now that we have a baseline default settings, let's go and try out some gameplay. Okay, so here we are with Crash Tag Team Racing, and what I'm running right here is 60 frames per second with an auto frame skip of 1. And you can see here on the top left screen, it's kind of dipping between like 30 and 60 frames per second on the left out of 60 frames per second, and sometimes it even dips below that as well. Basically what you want to do is you want to make sure that your gameplay is staying between 30 and 60 frames per second. As long as it stays within there and you have an auto frame skip of 1, you're probably going to have relatively smooth gameplay. Now when it dips below 30 frames per second, that's when you're going to start seeing lags and things like that. At that point you need to make a decision. Do you want to add a frame skip of 2 in there, so that would give you a max frame skip of 15 before it started slowing down? Or do you want to try to keep it at 1 and make sure you have the smoothest gameplay experience as possible? I personally don't like using a lot of frame skip because it tends to make the game feel very jerky and kind of weird feeling. But if you're really desperate to play a game and you don't want to deal with a lot of slowdown, the frame skip tool is what you're going to use in order to make sure it's playable. Now, one final point to make is the PSP emulator actually uses cache in order to load the files. So when you're playing a racing game or something like that, you'll find that the first lap has more hiccups than it does in the second and third lap. That's because it's caching all those files the first time around, so if you have hiccups right when you start a game, just give it 5 minutes and see how it plays after that. So I'm going to focus on harder to play games during the rest of this guide, and that's mostly to show you how to squeeze as much performance out as possible. You can see here with Liberty City Stories, I set a max frames per second to 30, and then I've also enabled a frame skip of 1. What that means is that anything up to 15 is going to play relatively smooth, but anything under 15 is not going to play very smooth at all. And you might be thinking, hey, 15 frames per second is totally unacceptable, right? That it's not smooth enough for you. And again, this is a compromise you're going to have to decide for yourself whether or not it's worth it. If you really want to play Grand Theft Auto on your RG351P, this is your best bet at this point. Honestly, this game is a little bit too slow for me. Because the world is so big, it's always caching these files and it never seems to catch up. So even though it's showing, 10 to 12 frames per second out of a max of 15 before it starts having slowdown, it's still too much to me. It's too slow. It's very hard to drive around. I kept getting into accidents because I just couldn't control my player. It's a similar story for God of War Chains of Olympus. This is one where it really benefits from setting a max frames per second of 30, but even then it'll dip below 15 for the most part, so you're still going to get a little bit of slowdown. Now this is miles better than if you tried to do a max frames per second of 60, or an auto frame skip of 1, or no auto frame skip, but at the same time, these are a lot of compromises you have to make in order to make it playable. And people could argue that this is not playable, that the frame skip is too high, it's just too jerky to be able to play correctly. And I sympathize with those ideas. If you really want to play a game well, you probably want to have very smooth gameplay. Unfortunately, if you really want to play God of War on a handheld console, this is the experience you should expect at this $100 price point of the RG351P. Now it's not all doom and gloom. You can see here with Bust-A-Move Deluxe, it's running at a smooth 60 frames per second. So it really depends on what style of game you're playing. Anything that's a 2D game or a puzzle game or even a role-playing game, for the most part, those are going to play pretty well. And honestly, some of these graphics are really nice. This is probably the most beautiful version of Bust-A-Move that you can play on your device. Okay, so let's move on to ArkOS, and now remember we have two different emulators we can use with this device. We're going to start with the standalone version, the one that is default with your device. But if you wanted to change them, what you would want to do is go into the settings, go into emulator settings, and then you can change it between standalone and standalone Go. And like I mentioned before, I wouldn't recommend the RetroArch one at all. So I'm just going to keep it at auto so that we use the standard standalone emulator here. So let's try out God of War Chains of Olympus first. So as you can see here, it has basically the same amount of performance as 351 Elec. At this point, they're basically playing the exact same emulator. Now, one point I do want to add as well is that if you're really trying to squeeze as many frames per second as possible, shutting off the audio altogether will give you about 3 to 5 additional frames per second. Personally, I think sound is a major component of playing a game, but if it's not important to you, it's not something you're looking forward to, then maybe that's an option for you. And as you can see, same issue here with Grand Theft Auto, it's still running under 15 frames per second, which gives you slower gameplay. It is pretty neat to play a full Grand Theft Auto game on such a small and low-powered handheld device, but at the same time, this amount of slowdown in the gameplay really affects the way I play. I was getting in all sorts of car accidents. I really didn't feel like I could give this game justice. Other games are really hit and miss, so for example here with LEGO Star Wars 2, it seems to run okay when you're in a small enclosed space, but as soon as the game world starts to open up, you will experience a lot of slowdown. I don't think it's the end of the world with LEGO games in particular, these are really just like kind of smash and collect games in the first place, but when it comes down to it, it really does hamper the experience. Moving on to Tekken 3, I've upped the frames per second to 60 frames per second, and then I've added a frame skip of 1, but you can see it's dipping below 30, so you're having a little bit of slowdown. You could probably change the max frames per second to 30, and then you would have pretty smooth gameplay, but I don't know if it'll be worth it for a game like this. It's just not going to look very beautiful at all. Now, one game I was surprised with is X-Men Legends 2. For the most part, if you play this with 60 frames per second and then you use an auto frame skip of 1, it runs pretty well. This was a game I really enjoyed when it first came out about 15 years ago, so it's pretty cool to play this one again. It's a lot like an X-Men version of Diablo. And honestly, it looks nice, it plays well, and it has a lot of cool nerdy like comic book features available to you. I really like this game. But in general, if you're looking for the best gameplay available, something like Little Big Planet, which is a 2D platformer, is probably going to be your best bet. And this one actually runs at a max of 30 frames per second anyway, and so because of that, you actually get very smooth gameplay when you're playing it. So now let's try the other emulator that's available to you in ArkOS. What you want to do is hover over a game and then hit select, and then go to edit this game's metadata. Within there, you want to select the emulator and then change up the emulator. Once you've done that, go ahead and select save and then boot the game up. So if you're having a problem with a certain game and it's not working well in the standalone emulator, try the PSSPP Go one. But it's not all perfect. For example, you can see here with Chains of Olympus, it has this weird kind of graphical glitch to it. And then with Liberty City Stories, I had about the same amount of performance. So this version of the PSP emulator is not going to fix every little thing, but there are certainly games that do better with this emulator. And I've gotten a lot of good feedback on which games play best, and so I'll make a small list of all of the ones that I've gotten feedback on my website, and I'll encourage you to leave some comments on the website as well if you want to add some that do play better with this emulator as opposed to the default standalone PSP emulator. So one thing that does work well across the board is cheats. And so I'll leave a link to this GitHub page here, but basically what you want to do is you want to download this cheat.db file, and then we're just going to add it to our SD card. So for example, here with ArkOS, you just want to go into the PSP folder, and then there's going to be a PPSSPP folder there, and then go into the PSP folder and then cheats, and then just save that cheat.db file right there. And that's all you have to do, and I'll show you how to access them here in a minute. Now for 351 Elec, it's a different story. If you go into the PSP folder, you'll find that there is no PPSSPP folder. What you need to do is go into Game Data, then PPSSPP, then PSP, and there is the folder there. And you can see there already are some INI files in there, which are actually also cheat files, but this cheat.db file is going to contain all of the cheats available for the PSP for every single game that's out there. So again, you just want to save this into the cheats folder. And really that's it. All you have to do is save that DB file in ArkOS or 351 Elec in the appropriate folder. So when you open up the menu, and we're here in ArkOS again, So what you want to do is you want to go into the settings, scroll down all the way and make sure that it says enable cheats. Once that's enabled, you'll be able to see the cheats folder. From there, all you have to do is hit that import from cheat.db. And there you go, it'll list out every single cheat available for that game. Now the person who made this database is Thai, and so you'll see some that are written in Thai, but for the most part you'll find everything you need in here. So just scroll through and then just select any of the cheats that you want to enable and they'll work immediately. So for example, you can see here with LEGO Star Wars 2, there's all sorts of options you can have. So let's try one out and show you how it works. So for my example, I'm going to use Ridge Racer. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add max acceleration, max speed, and unlimited nitro. And then I'm also going to increase my speed and acceleration. All you have to do is exit out of that and then start the game up. So if you're familiar with this game, you know, it runs fairly smoothly, but look at how well it plays now. Like I'm already at almost 200 miles an hour right from the get-go. It's ridiculous. It's so fast that it's actually really hard to control. So you can see I'm just kind of slipping and sliding all over the place. And it's kind of fun. And you know, one of the amazing things about this is that even though I'm driving so fast, the gameplay is still very smooth. So that says a lot about Ridge Racer. Now, because this is a PSP video, I want to take a moment and talk about the best case scenario when it comes to PSP emulation, and that's going to be through a PSP or the PS Vita, because the PS Vita actually plays PSP games natively. So you can see here with Liberty City Stories, it's running just perfectly smooth. And you know, on this 5-inch screen, it's just beautiful looking. But in general, if you're really wanting to play PSP games, and that's something that's very important to you, then you're not going to be able to get anything better than what you can find on the PS Vita. Now granted, this is a lot more expensive than the RG351P. I paid almost $200 for my PS Vita, but if PSP is that important to you, that might be something you want to look into. Not only that, but there's actually a native port of the original Grand Theft Auto 3 game on the PC. And this game runs beautifully. It's super smooth, the graphics are very nice and crisp. It's a very beautiful game. So if you love Grand Theft Auto and you love PSP games, you may want to think about getting a PS Vita instead of an RG351P just to help temper those expectations. Alright everyone, that's it for this video. At the end of the day, I really just wanted to show off all the options you have available to you when it comes to PSP emulation on the RG351P and the RG351M. And let me know if you have any questions in the comments below, and I'd love to hear from you if you have found other things that work really well for you. At the end of the day, my recommendation is to set those default settings that I mentioned earlier, and then just experiment with each individual game and see what works best for that game. In general, I would expect about 50% of the games that are available in the PSP catalog to run pretty well, and maybe even another 25% of those that are going to run basically flawlessly. In the end, I think it's better if you just stick with 2D games, maybe some puzzle games or role-playing games. Okay, that's it. Please like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.